Hey everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Indie Game Movement, the podcast that talks about the marketing and business of indie games. I'm Andrew Pappas, and I'm going to be your host today, and we're going to be talking about using market analysis without killing creativity. Market data has never been more accessible to indie developers, and yet many teams feel more constrained than confident using it. When numbers are treated as answers instead of signals, creative decision making can start to feel mechanical rather than intentional. So, today we're going to explore how to approach market analysis without killing creativity. We'll break down the difference between quantitative trends and qualitative player insight, while each falls short on its own, and how indie teams can use data as a compass to guide their creative direction without replacing it. So that's what we're going to be talking about right here today on Indie Game Movement. Hey everybody, and we're back, and today with us I have none other than Bobby Dusk. Bobby, how's it going? And thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me here. I'm very excited for this podcast.
Yeah, I am too. And folks, if you're not familiar with Bobby, he is the founder and creator of Marcan, and he's also the co-founder and technical director of Edge of Dusk, which is a studio he manages and such. And Bobby, please take a moment, tell us a little bit about Edge of Dusk, what you do there, what kind of things are you got making, and also what is Marcan?
Gladly. So, my sister and I started Edge of Dusk about 3 years ago here in Belgium. We focus on very visual 2D games. My sister, she's the artist, I'm the programmer.
Hmm.
And we've been doing that for the past 3 years. But this last 1.5 years, I've also been focused on Marcan. Now, Marcan, it's a tool for any developers to perform market analysis. More specifically, it's a plugin for both Microsoft Excel and Google Sheets. And the way it works is first you have to select a bunch of reference games for your game. So say that you have a project in mind. Then you search for a bunch of games that are similar to your project. Then you insert those through the user interface. And then Marcan will automatically generate an estimation of how much your project could theoretically make. And that's it in a nutshell.
Oh wow! So that's pretty impressive too to know. Like just and you said it's just a plugin, right? Like to either of those. Sweet.
Correct. So you can just download it through the Microsoft Excel or through Google Sheets, and it works just as every other spreadsheet. So it's very convenient that way.
Awesome. Wow. That definitely sounds like a pretty interesting and helpful tool, which I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about, not necessarily the tool itself directly, and in some capacity we may, as it relates to what we're going to get talking about in a moment. And because, of course, folks, as some of you may know, I'm really into the analysis side of things too. So this is going to be a good conversation, I think, for all, especially for those looking to get a little bit more insight on, hey, what kind of things should we be doing when it comes to market research? I was just sharing with someone the other day, like how many times past guests have said, like, what's your one key takeaway after a conversation? They're like, do the market research. So here's
Mhm.
that episode to maybe help guide some of you that need that a little bit of extra guidance and stuff. Because, hey, it can be tricky to navigate. Bobby, you shared some about Marcan, a little bit about Edge of Dusk. Uh, and it sounds to me like you're fairly pretty busy guy. So when you do have some downtime, because I hope you do, what do you like to do? What other things can you share with us today to help you unwind a little bit when you're not so digging into all
You
this
know,
analysis and everything?
the funny thing is that I'm actually really not all that much into video games. I do play them occasionally. More specifically, I play some Fortnite with my girlfriends. We especially like the festival gameplay where you have to
Mm.
push the buttons in the rhythm of the music. But apart from that, I'm actually way more into movies. For example, the last couple of weeks, I've been very much into war movies. I've watched, or Downfall in English, about the last days of Hitler in his bunker. I've also watched Jarhead, which is a
Oh
great
yeah.
movie, and then also like a Black Hawk Down. Really been enjoying all those movies. I'm also very huge Studio Ghibli fan. And it's funny, we went on a trip to Japan a couple of weeks ago, and there I discovered that for almost every Studio Ghibli movie, there's also an accompanying art book, which are absolutely beautiful. So as soon as I got back to Belgium, I immediately ordered all of those books, $400 worth of books, and I've just been enjoying myself perusing through all of those.
Awesome.
Yep.
You know, it's funny you talk about the movie thing because recently I started watching some classics myself that were on, some streaming services. And then I started thinking, I'm like, you know what? I think I got to watch some of these again. It's been too long. So, what was it? It was Misery. I just got done with
Mm,
Taxi Driver. And now I think the next one is going to be The Shining. So,
yeah, great movie.
yeah. So, anyways, and I would imagine in one of those war movies, what was it? Did Saving Private Ryan ever come up in the list?
Still planning on watching that one. I've already watched it a couple of times in the past, but I'm planning on rewatching it. Of course, it's a little bit more of a Hollywood
Yes,
movie, so to
yes,
say, compared to, for example, Der Untergang, which is
yes.
really a German movie, and you can also feel it. It's very serious. It's very not glamorous, which I personally like.
Yeah, no, there's
Yeah.
definitely those cool aspects too that you miss out with some of those Hollywood ones. But one thing I love and scares me a little bit too, Saving Private Ryan, is just the sound design in that is
Mm,
superb. At any rate, cool.
yeah.
Well, thank you for sharing that to let us know. And hey, no worries here in terms of not playing games as much because on occasion we do have some people. We have some people with crazy lineups and libraries, and then we have some like yourself and me even that it just don't get into games that much. It's not that we don't appreciate or love them. It's just I don't know. Sometimes different interests prevail, or hey, we can all be busy and bandwidth. We only have so much of it. So
Yeah, and just because you don't really enjoy playing games that much doesn't mean you don't enjoy making them or working with them in some other capacity. I personally
absolutely,
really enjoy coding, developing, everything related to video games, but just I'm very much more interested in storytelling than I am in gameplay. That's why my affinity goes more
yeah.
towards movies than games.
Yeah, not too long ago, we had guest Matt Dalio mention that too. Like what he's doing and building and the work that he's doing is like a game for him, which is kind of cool to see. Like the work I do is like a game, and that's what just gets me excited all the time. So, yeah, it's all different, all different perspectives and loves and passions. So great. Well, speaking of those types of things and taking some time to get to know you, we want to get to know you a little bit more. And how we do that is with the Q Box round. And folks, those of you who aren't familiar, Q Box round is just a few random questions I prepared here for Bobby today. So, Bobby, are you ready?
I'm ready, absolutely.
All right. First is what's the most helpful or impactful advice you ever received?
Very good question. And my response will also come up a lot throughout our discussion because it's also very much related to analysis, market analysis. But the best advice I've ever received is defining what success means to you and your studio. That's
Mm,
actually one of the first things my sister and I did 3 years ago when we first started our studio, is to sit down and figure like, hey, what if we had all the money in the world? What would we want our lives to be like? And at that point, we said to ourselves, if we had all the options, we would still just want to work from home, sit behind our desk, making our art or programming in my case, because that's what gives us the most fulfillment. That's what makes us the most happy. With that definition of success in mind, that guided all our decisions from that point forward.
that is such a good one to call out because it's one thing to say define success, what it means to you or your studio or whatever, right? Define what success means. But I love how you shared some context with what you and your sister did because this is such a really good exercise to do with anybody where it's like, okay, and actually I have had mentors do the same thing with me. Okay, you're trying to achieve something, whatever it is, right? Envision yourself with all that, then what? right? Because a lot of times when we're setting goals, success, all these things, they're attached to more tangible things that make sense, right? The biggest one is going to be financial success in some way, shape, or form, right? And it could be, you know, notoriety. It could be all these other things that are important. But when you put yourself in that situation, you think about things, and then what? Like you said, then it relates to fulfillment, because it's like, you know, when they say money doesn't buy happiness, that's exactly what these exercises are helping you with and stuff, because it's really easy to attach to something that's outcome based like that. But when you start thinking, like, if you have everything already, then what? And if you can't think of anything, it's okay. But you don't want to ever get to that moment and then find out, like, that's why you hear people, you know, winning the lottery, and the next thing you know, they don't have any money anymore because they never defined what it would mean once they have that. Sorry, I digress, but I had to jump on that because it's such a huge thing that I think a lot of us don't necessarily think about too much, because we're just busy in the day to day, which is important too.
And what you're also hinting at is that the journey, the process is way more important than the goal. And that's one problem that I had for the longest time. Pretty much all my life, I envisioned this kind of life for myself where I was hugely successful, where I had a very successful startup. And in order to achieve that goal, I always thought that I had to do things like go to networking events and socialize with all these people. But those are things that just fundamentally make me unhappy. I'm not a very social person. I'm happiest when I'm behind my desk doing my own thing. But so just having to live that process day in, day out, that made me fundamentally unhappy until I decided, like, hey, I'm not going to do this no more. I'm going to do the things that actually give me the most enjoyment. And that's the moment that I also started to become more and more happy.
I love that too. And I hope folks listening, you could take that for whatever it's worth to you. But I'm sure a lot of you could probably relate to that too. Just that idea of like, hey, just doing the thing that I love, that's moving me forward, pushing me forward. Yeah, all great stuff. And thank you for sharing that, Bobby. And sorry, folks, for digressing a little bit, but I had to jump on that one. I think it was essential and important for us. All right, next question is, what was your childhood favorite game?
It was Beyond Good and Evil on the PlayStation 2. And then a little bit later in life, I also thoroughly enjoyed Red Dead Redemption on the PlayStation 3. Both of those games are, once again, very story driven, and that's what drew me to those games. I loved the characters in Beyond Good and Evil. I loved the journey in Red Dead Redemption. So those are the games.
Awesome. Good choices. And last but not least here on the show is, what game are you playing now?
Yeah, as I mentioned, currently it's mostly a little bit of Fortnite with my girlfriends. For us, it's just a nice way to wind down the day, to have a little bit of enjoyment before we go to bed. Even though I must say, Fortnite might not be the ideal game for that, because if you're in one of those matches,
Oh, yeah.
your adrenaline really starts to pump. And if you do that just before going to bed, then you just lie there in bed, staring at the ceiling for another hour, just for your heart rate to
Yeah.
come down. But we haven't learned our lesson yet.
Yeah. Love it. Bobby, thank you so much for sharing that with us. And now let's get right into this conversation, as I'm sure many of us, including myself, and I'm sure you too, are excited to do. So, as I led in with the introduction, folks, we're here talking about using market analysis without killing creativity, right? Because I think that's one of the biggest problems some of us have when we think about what market analysis is, or at least understand it. Because, and I know I've talked to lots of people that feel this. It's like, hey, yeah, but if I do that, then that's going to take out the passion in what I'm doing and all this stuff. So we're kind of going to get into that. We're going to get more objectively and stuff. Like, there's lots we're going to cover. So to kick things off, Bobby, market analysis tools, I would say, are pretty much more accessible than ever. You have a tool, there's lots of tools out there. But why do you think so many indie developers then still struggle to make confident decisions with all this data that's available?
So I'm going to preface this by saying that I work purely in the realm of indie developers. I have no experience with AA or even AAA studios. So everything I say should be viewed through that lens. But I think that indie developers, and especially starting indie developers, they're oftentimes still quite starry-eyed. They let themselves be guided by their artistic vision, by their gut feeling, by those kind of things, without always necessarily thinking about the financial implications of their decisions and design decisions. So I think that's first and foremost, oftentimes you're just not that interested in performing market analysis in the first place. They would rather just pursue their vision for their game. It's usually only by the second or third game that they start to notice, like, hey, the things I do actually, the decisions I make actually have a huge impact on the revenue I'm able to generate through my projects. Yeah, on top of that, I would also say that it's oftentimes a bit of a lack of skills. So my background, I actually also worked in a fund management team for some time of a private bank. And my job within that team was to automate their data analysis processes. So I came into the game development realm with a huge deal of skills about surrounding data analysis. A lot of other indie developers don't have those skills. So for them, it might be a little bit tougher to do those things. That being said, as you mentioned, with the ease and the availability of the tools today, it's easier than ever to perform that market analysis.
Yeah, so it's like there shouldn't be much to hold back, but sometimes it's ourselves. But it's not to say we're our worst enemies type thing, because I think there's things that you mentioned too about, that vision and focus. I mean, it's like with anything, it can be somewhat of a balancing act, and balancing in the respect that sometimes you have different priorities at different points in times and stuff. Not that everything is ever equal, because it never is. That's
Mhm.
not how life works. That doesn't work for work either, or what you're building. But I mean, but still, I mean, in some situations, things got to give a little bit. And even if there's maybe not an interest there, as you said, later in time, there might be in stuff. But it all comes down to that balancing and asking questions and things like that, and whatnot. As we talked about this, I think this is a really good segue into kind of getting into a little bit more of what types of market analysis. I think sometimes, just like the term marketing gets thrown around quite a bit. It's like, oh, I need help marketing. Well, what is that? Like, is it PR? Is it like brand related stuff? Is it like, it could be any number of things. And even though market analysis is definitely a bit more defined, there are different layers. And the two that we're going to really focus on today is quantitative and qualitative. So let's talk a little bit more about the quantitative side, because I know that I think most of us listening are probably familiar with that and know the benefits it provides and everything else. But Bobby, what would you say are the types of quantitative signals that are generally useful for indie teams early on? And let's look at the flip side of that too. Which ones would you say tend to create false confidence as well? What are the difference between the quantitative information that's out there?
It's very easy to give yourself a false sense of confidence using quantitative analysis. For example, if you look at my tool, the first thing you do is you pick a bunch of reference games. Now, if you only pick the most well-known, the most successful reference games, then obviously the market analysis will show that your game will be hugely successful and an absolute blockbuster. But that's only, of course, because of your choice of reference games. So in that sense, it's very easy to give yourself a false sense of confidence. What you should do, however, is be a little bit more realistic in your choice of reference games. So not just say that you're making an RPG. Do not pick Baldur's Gate because it's the first RPG that came to mind. No, also look at, for example, who made the game, how many people worked on the game, what was their experience. If you're a team of four people who are working on their first game, then look at other games that were also made by such a team. And that should give you a far more realistic picture of how your game could perform. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, I would say definitely. And there's two things that I think that answer does basically answers both sides of it. Let's dig into it for a second. You called out to the comparison titles, and that's huge, because you led in saying, with like, in a lot of cases, people will be like, oh, this is the leader in this market and this market. And as you were saying that, what I was visualizing in that moment was pitch decks that I've seen before that do exactly that, pitching to a publisher. And it's like, hey, look, this is like a very popular title in this segment or in this market, whatever. And then they look at it, and it's like, you're comparing yourself to these titles what your game is. But the reality is, maybe your game doesn't even come close to relating completely. It might be in the same market, might even be in the same segment, but is it that close? And relation comes down to everything from the design, maybe even some of the USPs, the mechanics. But also, you brought up another good point too. How does it relate to the team? That's a very interesting factor. I don't think any of us really consider when we're looking at titles. We're looking at the design, the mechanics, the systems, all those things, but we don't look at the team behind it. Because if you think, if we're using this publisher view, this scenario I presented, they're looking at lots of other factors that they're considering. And even though we're talking about titles, there are inadvertent signals in there too, like what you just said about the team size. So if you're comparing yourself to Baldur's Gate and you're a small indie studio with, let's say, 10 people, right? That is a huge misalignment there. Unless, of course, you have other supporting information that puts you much closer to what that final product is with what your product is. And I think that's so essential that you called that out, because actually, I don't even often think about that when I'm doing my own analysis in terms of like team size. Obviously, it depends on the application, what things I'm looking at, but still, I thought that was very insightful to think of. And I'm sure there's probably many others that we could think of if we just take the time to think about it all. So we talked about how the negative side of that, but and this is why I think how you responded answers the other, because basically, I mean, from, let's say, some of those initial qualitative analysis, what are some of the useful signals? Is it just making sure that you're aligned with what those signals are? Like, for example, maybe doing comparison titles with titles that have a a similar team as yourself or whatever, especially for you in a pitch situation. Is there anything else that can give us signals that might be a little bit more useful for us to kind of hone in on?
Before I answer that question, I quickly, as an aside, I want to thank you for also bringing up publishers, because oftentimes starting indie developers, they wonder why they should perform market analysis in the first place. And publishers and pitch decks is actually a very great reason why you should perform market analysis. In pitch decks, if you're pitching in front of a publisher, they oftentimes expect there to be at least one slide about market analysis, like who are your competitors, how much money did they make. So that alone is already a great reason why you should perform market analysis, because they're going to do that anyway, right? If a publisher is going to invest $100,000 into your game, they're going to want to make sure that your game could at least make that return. So you might as well do it yourself too. But that is a small aside. Yeah, the positive signals. As you mentioned, if you find a bunch of games that are from a similar sized team and they were all very successful, then that is indeed a very good indication that you could also reach that same level of success. And once again, there too, it's very important to define what success is for you. That's also why Baldur's Gate is probably not a good reference for your project. Baldur's Gate consists of, I don't know how many different locations, 5, 6 locations over the entire world. They have hundreds of employees. They need to reach a certain level of success with their games. If they make 2D platformer, that kind of game would never be able to sustain their studio. However, if you're a studio of 2, 3, 4 people, then a puzzle platformer might be a great way to sustain your studio, because your required level of success isn't that high. That's yet another reason why looking at your required success, or what success is for you, is such an important factor. So yeah, I would definitely say, like, look at games that are really similar to your project, not only in genre, art style, all those kind of things, but also in team size, the experience of the team. And if you found 10, 20 of those reference games, and then you still see that there's a good chance that you might break even or even make some money, well, then that's a very good indication.
Yeah, and you know what? I love the last one you just mentioned too. Is like, if you're looking and finding lots of other titles that are similar, that are for whatever method determination we make, or let's say just generalized, are commercial successes in some way, shape, or form, and there's lots of them. That could be a really good signal of demand. And I think this gets into the next question really well, because demand is one of those things that we're always looking for, and sometimes we might misinterpret market data. when we're trying to validate ideas or genres. And I think at the high level of that is how we interpret, demand. I mean, there's lots of like information out there about which games are high in demand and stuff. You can do your own analysis. I know lots of companies do to see, okay, what is really the demand within this segment that you're trying to create a game for. But there could also be other signals that are hiding deeper that we don't necessarily see. So when it comes to doing that type of stuff, trying to validate ideas, how can we sometimes misinterpret what we're seeing in from either other sources or other types of data that we're taking in? What could be misinterpreting us to think, hey, this is a great idea to pursue?
Once again, it often comes down to the choice of reference games. People tend to focus on the wrong things sometimes when they're picking their reference games. For example, only looking at gameplay or genre, and not looking at the underlying reasons why people play those games. A great
Mm.
example that I always like to bring up is Spilled and Drenched, two small-ish games. One is really a very small indie game created by basically a team of two. Spilled, interesting story by the way. It's made by a Dutch girl who she herself also lives on a boat.
Yes, I'm
So
very
it's
familiar
very
with that. Yes.
so it's very cool that she then created a game about a boat. But then you also have Drenched, which is very similar in gameplay. You also have a boat that you can move around, but the tone is so drastically different between those games. Spilled is very whimsical, very cozy, whereas Drenched is really hardcore, dark, moody. So you have to ask yourself, like, how what is the chance that someone who has played Spilled will then also go on to play Drenched, or the other way around? In this case, I personally don't think that they're quite likely to play both games. I think that someone who played Spilled is far more likely to play Glade, for example, another
Mm.
very whimsical game. So one thing that people often do wrong is only looking at the gameplay, only looking at the genre, rather than looking at the motivation of the players.
Yeah, that is really a key, insightful thing because, and I see this a lot of too with quantitative data is like, what are we doing at this level or at this degree? We're breaking down, yeah, like you said, genres. We're breaking down mechanics, and then obviously we're looking at other numbers and stuff like maybe CCUs, players, units, all that stuff. And when we look at it kind of like this way, this is what I call surface level data because if you look mechanically, I think in a way, I think is Dredge and what's it called, spills, they're a form of extraction, right? It's like an extraction type game. If I want one, I mean, or they're similar, like core mechanics, if I'm remembering correctly. I haven't played either, right? So you have those two things. So and it's a boat, right? And so when you look at just this data on a sheet of paper, like, oh, these align completely well. The only thing that might be different in maybe some of the sales numbers and stuff, but otherwise, wow, the same. But to your point, when you look at things from a motivation side, there's other things relating to atmosphere and stuff that influence what type of motivation is. There's going to be other maybe deeper systems that start influencing in terms or starts really determining what that audience or player type really is. And a lot of that quantitative data doesn't necessarily show that at that surface level. It's still important to have it, but when you start trying to think about diving deeper, you're not necessarily, you won't get the insight that you really need until you start doing that further investigation. As we're talking about this, I'm also curious too, like, what's one or a common mistake that devs make when they're using market analysis to decide what game to build? Because I know, like, this probably happens a lot. I know, like, Chris Zukowski had some really cool numbers too, like, hey, here's like high demand games, here's a medium of them and stuff, and then some people they're like, all right, I'm gonna try a 4x grand strategy. It's like, no, because that's in high demand, right? So what are maybe that's just one extreme mistake, but what would you say are some others devs might make based off of maybe some analysis that they do themselves or they take in from other sources?
Well, the first mistake a lot of beginning developers make is not doing market analysis in the first place. So that's still something that a lot of indie developers need to force themselves to do. It's like eating broccoli as as Jason Del Rocca often says.
Yep. Yep.
So the first mistake is not doing market analysis in the first place. But then the second mistake is relying too heavily on that market analysis. I always like to say that market analysis can tell you what not to make, but it can tell you what you should make. For example, if you're once again looking at your studio size, looking at what kind of success you actually need, market analysis can tell you like, hey, you shouldn't make a 2D platformer because your team of 20 people, it will not be sustainable to only make puzzle platformers. But on the other hand, if you just look at the data and you see that all MMORPGs are pretty successful, then that absolutely does not mean that you yourself should also make an MMORPG. That's silly, because at the end of the day, you still need an original vision. You still need to create something that people actually want to play. And if your game ends up being the same as 20 other games that already exist, then there's no reason for them to play your game. Any day of the week, I would pick an original vision in a genre that might not be as successful according to the market analysis over a very bland, typical, stereotypical game in a very popular genre.
And what you called out too in terms of originality, being original, I think that component there plays really well into the creative, the passion side of things too. And I think it goes back to kind of what I was sharing a little bit before in different context was, balancing. It's like, okay, you got to have passion in whatever you're doing, right? That I think we've all determined this at some point in shape, despite some past episodes or wherever else you get information from where passion needs to be part of it, but it can't be the whole thing, because then it probably borderlines hobby project, right? If you set up a business, and if at least here in the US, I'm sure it's a lot with other governments, if you establish a business and you're not reporting any gains or anything at a certain point, it's basically determined as this is a hobby, it's not a business, right? In some context or whatever there. So there's that. So it really comes down to that balance, as you were saying, like really understanding and knowing, hey, and again, it goes back to what you're saying about defining success. If you want to have if you are, let's say, I want to launch my first commercial product, great. Then start treating it like a commercial product, and then looking at the areas of doing that analysis, understanding what's important, looking at those things objectively, but then having that balance to say, okay, great. Forex grand strategy. Yeah, I know that could be very viable from a financial perspective, but I got 3 people. Do we even have the skill sets to execute on that? Are we going to burn ourselves out? Are we going to then hate making games after that whole experience because we're getting into stuff that actually we found out we hate? Like, don't do that to yourself. But that's the tricky part with the analysis and also the passion part. Where do you find where can you play to your skills, strengths? Where do you play to your team members' strengths? And also where do you play to the creative and passion side? So that, and then finding that right cool little spot. And don't be super comfortable. What I mean by that is, as an example, don't just do like a 2D platformer. Now I'm saying like, don't just like have that be a default. If a 2D platformer is ideal for your team, it's your first project, just do a quick cycle, learn from the experience, and then one up from there. Because otherwise, I think, and I'd say you probably agree to this. I mean, if you're just staying in your comfort zone, not pushing yourself, you're not going to get much further to wherever you want to be either.
Exactly. Success does not always have to be financial success. The learning experience or publicity can also be great KPIs that you can pursue. And in that sense, making a puzzle platformer can be a great choice for a starting team. It's once again, it's all about what are your goals? What do you actually want to accomplish with your game?
Yeah, absolutely. And folks, I mean, we know it's been well stated, and I think we're all familiar with this idea that, hey, 2D platformers, especially let's say that's your first project and you wanted to make it a commercial product, that 2D platformers might not be the best place. It's oversaturated, all this other stuff. But I want to now, maybe with that lens a little bit, we'll probably shift it to, let's get into now the qualitative insight side of things when it comes to market analysis. And I'm prefacing this with the 2D platformer for a specific reason, because there could be a lot of things in that very saturated market that maybe haven't been done before, that we think as have and stuff, right? There could be. Well, this is the theory, but qualitative analysis can start maybe revealing that. So to open up to this question now, what would you say, Bobby, are kinds of signals that qualitative analysis can provide you with the clearest understanding of whether a game idea actually resonates with players, or maybe reveals a missed opportunity or things like that? Like, what are some signals that we can get out of that type of analysis?
Well, I'm very happy that you moved to qualitative analysis because people often think that they're opposing things,
Mm.
whereas I really do not see them as opposing things. I rather see them as going hand in hand. For example, with my tool, I would define my tool as being very much a quantitative tool because it really deals with numbers and it gives you a revenue estimation at the end. However, I would say that the result of my tool, the actual numbers, are the least interesting thing or the least valuable thing about the tool. What is way more valuable about the tool is the process. Actually looking at those reference games, figuring out what makes them similar, where your game is unique, what they do well or what they do not do as well, and where you can improve upon. Those are the things that actually teach you the most about your game. And those are very much qualitative things, even though you're applying them in a quantitative process. So qualitative and quantitative very much go hand in hand. But as to your question, like what are the clearest qualitative signals as to whether your game will resonate with players? It's a difficult question because all games are so different. There are some games that will do really well with streamers, and that could be a great KPI for you, like looking at how many views your game or similar games received on streaming sites. Other games could be much more games that are played within small groups of people, and there you might look at Reddit posts or forum threads where they discuss those games. So really, depending on your game, I would define the KPIs, not the other way around. That being said, I do think that there are some indications that almost always apply. For example, how much do people talk about your game, and with how much passion do they speak about your game? If you go on Reddit, for example, and you search for similar games to your game, and people just you get a sense that people live for that game. It's all they talk about. It's all they think about all day. Well, that's then a great indication that there is a market for your kind of game.
So all good stuff. And what you're saying is a lot of these signals are things that we're probably accustomed to some degree and such, of feedback, reviews, things along that line, like different spaces where discussions are happening about that. But I know for some of us, they might not be getting any of that type of attention. So how could you say that small indie teams maybe gather some meaningful qualitative insight, especially, let's say, from whether it's like tools or services, and of course, without large budgets or formal research setups? Because I'm sure some of us, struggle with this idea too, or trying to find out, well, where do I get this, especially if I don't have any of my own data to work with.
That's a very good question. And you mentioned a lot of tools and whatnot. And I do know there are a lot of tools, and that's more and more they try to also capture the qualitative side of things, not only the quantitative aspects. But that being said, I think at the end of the day, it's still the best to just go where the players are. Go to Reddit, go to YouTube, look what people are saying, even go as far as going to events and talking to people in real life. I think that will give you the best sense of what people are actually thinking, why they play certain games, and that will give you the best indication of what you should do with your game.
Yeah. And so, like, of all those like channels, platforms, whatever you mentioned, even like events, right? I think I would say there's probably like two good ways to approach that. One, it could be generalized, meaning like Oh, like you mentioned Reddit as one, for example. There's lots and lots of communities that are really focused on specific genres like Metroidvania or, strategy games, RPGs, all that stuff. Just make sure when you're looking at RPGs, it's not also like tabletop RPGs, because
Mm, yeah.
that distinction's important. But like going to those types of communities and seeing what people are sharing, and sometimes you can maybe even get the same level of attention. Let's say if you go back to what we were talking about before with comparison titles, and let's say you have that list of titles that you're using for your initial research, seeing what people are saying about those titles too to get a better sense, and whether it's a Reddit community or whether it's Steam reviews or whatever. As you said, start looking into those places where these conversations are happening, are really going to give you good insight. And there's one more thing I'm going to throw out there, which I know there are a lot of people that say this and probably do it too, and it still holds a lot of value. Me personally, I can't do this because I just don't have probably the time or bandwidth, but it really does come down to, of those comparison games or other games in your space, play the games. Like that
Yeah,
is
of
going to
course.
give you,
Yeah.
I mean, that's, I think, kind of a given, especially for us that are the ones creating the core creators, the leads, whatever, behind the experience. Playing those games is going to be as insightful too. But man, when you're getting insights and from other players, the discussions and those memorable moments that they're sharing in these communities and such, that's also going to give you a whole nother perspective, lens, depth than what you might be able to obtain just from playing the game yourself too.
It's such an obvious thing to play those reference games that I didn't even think about
I
it.
know,
But
right?
just obviously also play the games. That should actually be the first thing that you do.
Yeah, but still, it's you know, what we're all saying, and I'm sure some of you are thinking that's a lot of work. It is a lot of work. But what the end result of, and here's the thing, because I know this is a problem a lot of devs face. It's like, okay, fine, I play all these games. Let's say, so what's that expectation? Let's say the extreme. I play it all the way through. Okay. Then, okay, go browsing all these communities to see what people are saying. I browse Steam reviews. I'm like, that's like so much work. And we're not sugarcoating it here. Yes, it is. But this is where I think not just developers or whatever, people in general, when it comes to being really invested in something like this, that work does pay off. And it's not going to feel like progress because you're not sitting down, coding, whatever, progressing on your game. But with the information you have from that process, it will save you further, definitely can save you time, save you from making mistakes. And mistakes can cost time and money, resources, all these other things. And I think that's, maybe we go back to one of the questions before. It's like, what are some of the reasons people might not do that? And it's like, it could be because they think they're not making progress by doing that work because I'm not physically coding, progressing, getting the game to hit its milestone on time because I'm doing things that I don't see as a meaningful progression for this project.
Yeah, as you say, it takes a lot of time to do a proper market analysis. But you know what also takes a lot of time? Reinventing the wheel. So oftentimes you have very clear vision of where your game wants to innovate. Oftentimes, you want to do a game that's 90% the same as games that already exist, and then that is very innovative in 10% of the game. And that can already be a great game that a lot of people are going to buy. You don't have to create a 100% innovative game. But then for that 90%, you still have to create a product that is as polished, that plays as intuitively as all the games that already exist. So for that 90%, just blatantly copy what already exists. But in order to do that, you need to understand what already exists very well. And you do that by indeed playing those games, looking at what people are saying. And by the way, on the topic of actually playing those games, I don't think it's necessary to really play those games yourselves, as not from start to finish at least. You can often get by just playing like a couple of hours of a game and then watching a bunch of gameplay footage on YouTube. That's often good enough, just to get a sense of how they do things
Yeah.
and then apply it to your game.
Yeah, and exactly. Like there's quick and efficient ways to do that. Like you said, videos are one of the best things. I mean, that's a tool I use like especially trailers of games. When I'm like comparing other games too, trailers of games that feature a lot of gameplay. I get a quick snapshot, boom, idea of, okay, this is what this. I don't have to go through. If I'm making a game, I probably want to do a lot more research and maybe dive into some like YouTube content and stuff too. But still, that is much, much faster than like playing through a whole entire game, especially if you're like Bobby and I, that we just don't always have the capacity or means or even interest to play games, depending on whatever's going on in our lives. And you called out another interesting too, because the whole process and all this and whatever depth or as high level you want to go, ultimately what you're looking for in these processes too is, and you said it, when you're looking at what do people expect, what do they like, and you even said like copying, and I'm gonna like call out here, Bobby, but no means is telling you go out and copy a game, right? But if you think about it, like there's gonna be definitive characteristics of any genre out there, right? So we know that. But when you look at how things are done, the way I like to say what Bobby was saying is copy those things and improve upon them. Or my phrasing I like to use is exceed existing value, or ask the question, how can I exceed existing value? Oh, great. All these strategies or whatever RPGs have turn-based play. Is there something else I can do differently that exceeds that value? I have the turn-based, but what else? Maybe it's a new take of turn-based. Maybe it's still turn-based, but there's some other mechanic or system, whatever, that you put in there that no one else is offering, and you get some signals or ideas in how that can be improved. There's lots that can be done in there. And I think to kind of start closing this, sometimes we get so concerned with the data and having the information and taking what we can with the signals. Maybe it's not so much about the data. Maybe it's also about how we're asking questions about the data that we're getting, or about what we're creating, or about what our goal is and what our vision is. I mean, what do you think of that perspective? Do you think sometimes we can just rely too heavily on data, whereas simply just thinking of what perspective we're looking at or how we're asking the questions to solve the problems can make a difference?
Situations in which we rely too heavily on data. Yeah, I definitely think that can happen. That's a difficult one.
And folks, I am putting Bobby a bit on the spot here because this is not a pre-planned question and stuff, but
No, exactly. Yeah, I think if you rely too heavily on the data, that can stifle innovation, right?
yes, yep.
But also kind of piggybacking on our previous discussion, I think that the best projects are always a combination of things that are very familiar and things that are very innovative or unique. And that doesn't only go in the domain of game development, but really in any domain.
Yeah.
If something is completely unoriginal, then people will say like, hey, why would I even bother with this if this other existing thing already exists? However, if something is completely unique in every single aspect, then people won't know what to do with it. And then they're just confused and lost. So you always have to strike that right balance between giving something familiar that people know, like, oh, I know this, I'm familiar with this, I feel comfortable with this, but then also give them something that they can be excited about. But then to actually answer your question, I think that if you're too stuck on data, then you might just end up copying people blatantly. You see that certain games, MMORPGs, are really successful, and then you just decide to create one of those purely because the data tells you to, and that would be a huge mistake.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's sometimes the problems that some of us run into. We are so focused on that. We're the numbers, the high level stuff, and then we make decisions based off of that. And then next thing you know, we're running into these future problems of, why am I burning out? Why isn't this fun anymore? Why? Well, you're asking the question of why retrospectively, because it's not aligning with where you wanted to be and everything. So I think that's a really cool way to look at those things, because yeah, and I think it goes back to the on the spot what I posed too, because we can't always be so rigid in our thinking. We can't be so rigid with what we find are facts. And in moments when, let's say, data may even conflict with each other, sometimes we're going to have to like maybe trust one more than the other, but be flexible in how those things are. There's going to be moments, yes, you do have to go with your gut, but make sure you or at least have enough signals, information to make an informed decision about that and be flexible. Because like you said, if we're too focused on this stuff, then it might take us in a direction we definitely didn't want to go in. And yes, it might sound counterintuitive, but it it does happen, and it can happen, and it'll probably continue to happen unless we're asking these questions.
That's actually also one of the big mistakes that we made in our studio. My sister and I, we were very new to the gaming industry. As I mentioned, we don't really have game development backgrounds. My sister is an artist, I'm a software developer. And initially, we had so little confidence in our own vision that we took any advice that was given to us. Somebody said something like, hey, if I were you, I would do this or that. We took that advice and we implemented it. And what was the result? The result was that our first prototype and our first couple of prototypes actually were horrible. They lacked any vision, they lacked any consistency. They were a mess. And I attribute that mostly to us not being confident in our own decisions, in our own vision, in saying like, hey, I appreciate the feedback, but actually we're gonna do it our way. So yeah, that.
Yeah, and that's I'm glad that happened at the prototype stage too. But yeah, I mean that's one of those situations too. You take those things in, whatever signal is. In your case, it was like just feedback from maybe other players, devs that you players that you reached out to, or even devs, and then you start throwing it all in there, and you're like, okay, this isn't fun anymore. This isn't doing what it needs to do and stuff. And yeah, and it's a really good example of how that can happen in a short time, but it also can happen in over a long period of time. And when that happens, there comes a point where you can't revert back. And then the
Mhm.
question becomes, do you continue or do you stop? And that is a much bigger, harder decision to make on either front. So,
And yeah, of course, then it's always what you then have to do is take a couple of steps back to revert back to your original vision. I can imagine that that's also the reason why some games take so long to develop. For example, Beyond Good and Evil 2. I still hope that one day that game will come out, but I'm starting to lose confidence. But in any case, yeah, it's feedback, player feedback, or expert feedback is still very valuable, but you should always really inspect it and really think like, okay, to what extent does it actually apply to us? And do we 100% agree with it without just taking it or adopting it no matter what it is?
yeah.
You should always question it somewhat, but still be thankful for it because it shows that people are actually interested and that actually want to help you. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
something like this.
exactly. And I think that's a great point that you're saying, where sometimes with qualitative data, you can get some great insight. Maybe there's lots of that insight popping up, and that kind of validates the things, but it's not technically validating it at that point. It's just giving you a very strong signal. So it's a matter of testing that out. Everybody wants this feature in the game. There's none of these features in this game, and then you're like, hey, let's try it in our prototype. You put it in there, and then you're like, now we know why no one puts this feature in their game. Or we could be like, why hasn't anybody put this feature in their game? And there you go. That's a process. Because otherwise, if you act on some of these signals without further validating and testing, it's just strong signals aren't a core form of validation. It's a type, not the main thing.
And that's also the reason why we have prototypes, right? In order to give you that freedom to experiment and to figure out what actually works. That's also why you should really refrain from diving too deep during the prototyping phase. You should refrain from polishing or doing any of those kind of things before you actually know what your game is really about. Rami Esmail, another great, very famous indie game developer, also has a great article on that about first experimenting till you really have a clear, consistent vision, and then closing the door behind you, and then saying like, okay, that's it, no more big changes. This is what we're doing, and that's the point at which you're gonna start polishing, diving deep into the features, those kind of things.
Absolutely. Well, Bobby, I know we're coming on time here, and it's been great. But before we depart, I would love for you to maybe share a few tips, suggestions, or recommendations based off of our conversation here today? Because we talked about a lot.
Absolutely. So I think that the number one most important thing, not only for your studio, but also for you, your happiness on a personal level, is to decide what success looks like for you and your studio. Really figuring out what makes you happy and then doing that. And not thinking like, oh, I will be happy if I reach this goal or I accomplish that. No, really look at what day-to-day activity actually makes me the happiest. And knowing yourself on that level, it's a lifelong journey. I've only scratched the surface figuring that out, but still it's such an important thing to do. So that's my most important suggestion. Then the second one is to actually do market analysis, but to also view it as a process and not just a goal. Really try to learn your game, to get to know your own game through that process of getting to know what already exists. That's the most important part of a market analysis, not what the final number is that it spits out. No, really the process of getting to know the environment, the context in which your game will live. And then the final piece of advice is to be confident in your own vision. If you really have a clear vision, if you think that you know what will make your game unique and great and exciting to play, then go for it, no matter what potential issues people might bring up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. Great stuff there. Really can't appreciate you enough for being here today and sharing all that stuff. Hey, Bobby, if people want to reach out, learn more about Edge of Dusk, or find out about Marcan, that cool tool, especially if any listeners are considering about reaching out to publishers or any other types of things that they would do that tool would be helpful, please drop us some links.
Absolutely. So you can find the tool at marcan.games. It's a free tool, so you can just download it free of charge. We're still looking for a lot of feedback on the tool. So if you're starting to use it and you figure out that things can be better or you find some bugs, please let us know at info@marcan.games. Marcan, by the way, is MARKAN. It stands for Market Analysis, marcan.games. And the studio, our website is edgeofdusk.com.
Awesome. So, folks, if you're interested in that free tool, Marcan, check it out, marcan.games, and of course, edgeofdusk.com to find more about what Bobby and his sister have been working on. Bobby, I can't thank you enough for being here. It's been a pleasure, diving in some, deep market analysis stuff. And yeah, it's been great to have you here on the show.
Well, thank you very much for having me, and it is always a pleasure to talk to you.
Hey everyone, thank you for listening to another episode of Indie Game Movement. I'm Andrew Pappas, your host, and the show's producer is Mustafa Price. Show notes for this episode can be found by visiting rengenmarketing.com, the number episode of the show. Rengen Marketing is a consulting marketing company that helps indie devs with their marketing efforts. Whether you need guidance with your game's marketing strategy or could use a free marketing plan template, then please visit www.rengenmarketing.com and take action. A special thanks to Dakota Saw for Season 2's opening theme and Melissa Gellis for the new logo design. And as always, thanks for being such great listeners, and we'll see you next time on Indie Game Movement.